Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what was going on in Russia during World War II. You will recall that at the beginning of the war, Russia and Germany had signed a non-aggression pact saying that they wouldn't attack one another when Germany invaded Poland. That lasts for a couple of years, basically until not until 1941, and then in 41 and 42, the Germans go ahead and invade Russia, and this is just prior to really American entry of the war in 43. Well, the end of 42 and 43 in North Africa. So that gives a kind of time frame here. Once the Germans go ahead and invade Russia, the first major city that they look to go ahead and take is the city of Leningrad, which today we call St. Petersburg, up on the Baltic Sea. And this takes place in the winter of 41 and 42. Basically, what the Germans do is, rather than go ahead and invade the city and have to level it, they try to lay siege to the city, which means they surround it and they try to keep everything out. And the only way that Leningrad hangs on really at all through the winter, really everybody would have probably starved or died, and they would have had to surrender, except for the fact that the Germans couldn't shut off the supplies coming in via the ice. The Germans weren't comfortable taking their heavy equipment out on the ice, and so the Russians were able to sneak some supplies in via ice routes on the Baltic Sea. Nonetheless, even with those supplies, the supplies are far too limited for the city. It's a large city numbering in the millions. And so there's a lot of hardship in that city. Literally, thousands of people are dying every day in the siege of Leningrad from starvation. They just literally starve to death. Or they freeze to death. They die from exposure. Exposure means they're freezing to death. One of the things that they weren't able to get in was heating oil, and so they weren't able to heat their homes. And in the Russian winter, that's a deadly situation. In January then of 1942, the Russian government realizes they have to try to do something to try to relieve Leningrad, and so they send a Russian army to try to go ahead and break through the siege and get to the city, and they lose an entire army. The Germans wipe them out. A few months later, in May of 1942, the Russians will try yet again, and again, their army is not up to the task. Their army is ill-equipped, it is poorly trained, and the Germans are exemplary. And they go ahead and they defeat and capture a second Russian army. By the end of the siege, by the end of the year of 1942, two-thirds of the city's population will be dead. And so absolutely devastating effects. A little bit later on, by August of 1942, the Germans go ahead and move to the city of Stalingrad, and they try the same technique here. They try to lay siege to the city. The siege begins August the 24th, when panzer divisions, or the tank units, panzers are German tanks, enter the outskirts, the suburbs of Stalingrad. And from there, the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, will go ahead and raid, will go ahead and drop bombs on Stalingrad in the hopes of the city, of subduing the city, of causing the city to go ahead and surrender. A lot of the bombs they drop are incendiary bombs, which set fire to a lot of especially your wooden buildings, and thousands are killed in these air raids. It also leads to urban fighting. Again, to the surprise of the Germans, the Russians do not surrender. And so they decide to defend the city, house to house, every building. And when the Germans destroy a building, they take the rubble and they pile it up in the streets to barricade the streets, forcing the Germans to come out of their vehicles and making them vulnerable to Russian soldiers who were fighting street to street. The Russian soldiers literally are fighting 24 hours a day, sometimes for several days at a time. They would do this with a combination of benzodrine and alcohol as a stimulant to try to go ahead and keep them awake for longer periods of time, because they were incredibly outnumbered and there was no hope of reinforcements. Nonetheless, they go ahead and stage a defense of Stalingrad, which becomes really a model of urban fighting till this day. Not going down the street, but rather tossing grenades and blowing up the walls and going from building to building and city block to city block in that way. And so again, absolutely brutal fighting in Stalingrad. But Stalingrad is definitely the high water mark. The Russians go ahead and learn their lesson from Leningrad. And when they launch a counteroffensive, they're not going to try to break through the German lines. Rather, they realize they have a huge advantage in manpower. So the Russians this time just decide they're going to surround the Germans who are surrounding Stalingrad. And they're going to let the Russian winter beat the German army. And sure enough, the German general realizes what's going on. He radios back to Berlin, asks Adolf Hitler for permission to retreat. Let us go back and we'll come back in the spring. But right now I'm in danger of being cut off from my supplies. And the Russian winter, we are not equipped to fight in the Russian winter. We didn't bring heavy enough clothes. Our guns and our machines are not equipped and not outfitted for this type of fighting. But Hitler looks at this as absolutely disgusting. He views the German general as a coward. He fires him, brings him back to stand trial in Berlin, and put somebody else in charge who will go ahead and sit there. And sure enough, the Germans are surrounded, and the army is captured. The Germans are forced to surrender on January 31st. It's of 1943. It's really the first major surrender of any German army. A few months later, the Rommel will go ahead and surrender in North Africa as well. So these things are kind of happening kind of in conjunction or right around the time of one another, North Africa and the Russian campaign. By the time it's all said and done, 72,000 Germans will be dead, 42,000 will be injured, 107,000 are taken prisoners. And while those numbers are significant, the bigger significance is that the Germans will not stop retreating now until they get to Berlin. Stalingrad represents the high water mark of the German advance into Russia. They never get any further than Stalingrad. And as amazing as the casualty numbers are for the Germans, they are far exceeded by those of the Russians. One of the more conservative estimates that's out there is approximately 1.25 million Russian casualties during the Battle of Stalingrad. So again, the Germans kill a lot more of the Russians than the Russians kill of them, but the Russians had more to give, and so the Russians end up winning the Battle of Stalingrad, although at a great cost.